Have you been refining your mixed martial arts skills and chokeholds in anticipation of some highly contentious discussions at the Thanksgiving or Christmas dinner table this year? After the recent US elections, are you considering hiding a taser under your napkin for that crazy visiting relative sitting across from you saying, "How could anyone be stupid enough to vote for that person?" And that person, of course, being the one you voted for, sincerely believing that that's the best option for America. Yep. Welcome to Thanksgiving 2024. I'm Dr. Alistair Taylor, a licensed clinical psychologist and 2024 election fallout survivor, and reconciling differences of opinion is a big part of what I do. So here are a few brief tips on finding common ground with someone where none seems to exist. So the first, admittedly kind of weird lesson I want to give is from an illustration. This object is known as a Necker cube, and it is ambiguous concerning its orientation, meaning you can see it as if you're looking down at it, or see it as if you're below and looking up at it. Hopefully you can see that now if you aren't familiar with this image already. The thing with this image is that you can't see both perspectives simultaneously. And when you try to see the other, you might initially be locked in on the first perspective you see, but then it will suddenly switch, and then switching between the two perspectives will become easier. What does that have to do with political viewpoints? This somewhat oversimplified example relates more to visual processing, but it is also true of the brain in general as an information processing machine. Remember, the brain has not actually seen the world we live in. It essentially constructs our experience of reality via different sensory inputs, which is somewhat parallel to how we construct meaning from random bits of information. As this relates to differences of opinion, you can't really see the other perspective without letting go of the first. In other words, you have to open yourself to a new way of seeing to let the new knowledge in. Another way of saying that is you have to learn to join with the other person's perspective to understand what they're saying or why they hold the position they do. As you might imagine, this requires a lot more curiosity, patience, and suspension of judgment than just name-calling and saying the other person is dumb or that their ideas are dumb. By the way, joining with the other person doesn't magically transform you into an ardent member of the opposing party. You can try to understand someone without actually abandoning your own values, and you can agree to disagree respectfully. Hearing someone who has a different opinion from you is not like exposing yourself to a contagious disease. We don't say, I was talking to Janet yesterday about her crazy political beliefs, and today I woke up and I had leprosy. It doesn't work like that, right? It's not that dangerous to have a diplomatic exchange of ideas. And so you also might notice that you first saw the cube as if you're looking down on it. That also might not be the case. It isn't with everyone. But most people see that perspective first, probably because when we do encounter boxes in real life, we're looking down at them, not up at them. It's another indication of our biases based on past experiences and how they influence our expectations. We're used to seeing boxes down on the ground, not hovering up in the air. If you happen to grow up in a bit of an insulated bubble where the political discussions lean heavily in one direction only, you're more apt to blend in with those viewpoints, which is actually also similar to group identity theory in psychology, and that in turn probably aligns with our innate drive to fit in and feel accepted. And if you start to break from the group and challenge the ideology, you are at higher risk of rejection and ridicule, which most of us don't want. Unfortunately, social media algorithms can reinforce this bubble by showing you something supporting your established view and limiting what you see on the other side of that argument. However, just because you are biased to see a perspective from one side doesn't automatically mean the other perspective is wrong or threatening. And you can also see and understand the other perspective without necessarily losing your own, assuming you can navigate the two positions with some critical thinking and a willingness to see that your first perception is not the only perception. And I'll save this one for another episode because it's a bit long, but other psychological experiments have demonstrated that we can be unconsciously manipulated into seeing one perspective over the other when presented with these types of ambiguous images, and this manipulation happens at a subconscious emotional level, especially if we are incentivized to see one perspective over the other. The same thing happens a lot in political debate. A lot of times, our emotions drive us to see things one way and unconsciously refute all evidence to the contrary, even if some of the opposing evidence is valid. So bottom line here is that we are not very good observers of our own biases and our so-called choices in what we see in life. Taking this a step further, humans love to think in dichotomies or black and white constructs. It's one of the reasons why politics can be so polarizing and why us versus them sentiments can be so strong. Part of this is just our human nature and how the brain constructs meaning. For example, if you happen to be walking across the Arctic on some sort of adventure or expedition, would you feel more comfortable with polar bears being white or if they were black? I'm guessing it would be the latter, but why? Well, you're a tasty snack for a polar bear as a start, but your chance of being eaten is only as good as them sneaking up on you. They're white for a reason. They have exceptional camouflage in the snow. If they were black, we'd see them from miles off against that stark white backdrop and have plenty of time to take evasive action. What does this mean in the context of political discussions? We tend to struggle with ambiguity and vague concepts that are not obvious, or trying to see something we can't easily comprehend, like that sense of unease that a well-camouflaged polar bear is tracking you and you just can't see him. Uncertainty creates more anxiety. Contrast is actually what enables us to see things in the natural world. If everything in the world was one color, it would actually be really hard to see any individual objects. So ambiguity makes us a little anxious, and what we do is we default to what is readily apparent or simple black and white explanations for things, and that can sometimes filter down into somewhat oversimplified statements we hear like, he's just a racist, or she's just a communist. You know what I mean. It's also part of why people have brand loyalty if they're okay with a given product, because there is more certainty, whereas trying new things implies the unknown, such as frequenting one or two favorite restaurants even though there are many other choices. Not only that, but seriously contemplating the alternative or a new condition causes us to focus more on possible negative outcomes rather than possible positive outcomes. For example, what if you were to try the new restaurant and the food wasn't that great, and now you missed an enjoyable evening at the Old Faithful? The risk seems scarier than the possible reward, so we stay in our comfort zone and resist change. A lot of times, we resist ambiguity because it takes time and critical thinking to work through, or even admit we might be wrong and need to change our viewpoint. In contrast, snap judgments are quick and easy and align with our tendency to follow heuristics and stereotypes about others. So, in trying to break down this black and white thinking, could you admit to even a 1% possibility that there is something good about the other political party, and there is at least 1% of something that is not great about who you voted for? Because anything less than that is just absolutist black and white thinking, representing the all or none dichotomies that get us into trouble. That type of thinking in and of itself suggests you might be a little bit of a fanatical zealot rather than someone who can use critical thinking to assess the pros and cons of both parties. Things in life are seldom black and white, and if you catch yourself using a lot of always and never language, you know what I'm talking about. Also, if the other side is all bad, then it sounds like you might be dealing with an intolerance of others' opinions, and maybe you need to take a good hard look at yourself before calling out others. Now, if you can hold space for the 1% on the other side that might have a little bit of validity, now at least you have some space where you can come together and see where there is common ground. Humans also seem to have an unfortunate habit of coming together only when there is a unifying tragedy, like a 9/11 or a Hurricane Katrina. It's only then that we start to see that we are all just human, people with feelings and families, and usually want the best for those we care about, including more generally our fellow man. If you've ever been in a situation where you are trying to help save someone's life, as I have a few times, and when I was out in Big Surf and someone was at risk of drowning, you don't first assess their political affiliation before helping. Humans are just weird about drawing up arbitrary boundaries that divide us, whether it be politics, sports teams, diets, or car brands. And it usually seems to happen when things in life are going okay, and we just need something to fuss about, and it's just silly. It's almost like we need an existential threat to humanity or a huge natural disaster to be reminded of what's really valuable in life. I get that political issues can carry significant consequences, but have you ever shamed somebody into converting to the other party? Said something like, "Man, you're not just stupid, you're a Republican," or "I didn't realize being a Democrat was a disability until now." Just insulted them to the point where they said, like, "Wow, I guess you're all right. I really am that stupid. I should just change the way I see things and convert right now." So you can win people over a lot more effectively by treating them respectfully and not dehumanizing them. Getting someone to change their mind is getting around their defensiveness, not bringing up more of it. Next, you should expect resistance from the other side, even if you're winning the debate in a respectful way. You can't fully understand the complex reasoning and life experiences for why the other person holds their positions, so don't expect them to just turn on a dime and abandon long-held views. Cognitive dissonance is another flaw of human nature, defined as having inconsistencies in one's thoughts and beliefs, especially when it comes to attitude change, and even more so on value-laden topics. We don't like to be wrong, and for people who grew up with intense criticism and shaming when they made mistakes, they really, really don't like to be wrong. You have to be patient with that. Cognitive dissonance is so hardwired into human nature that you can see it very starkly in brain disorders like anosognosia, alien hand syndrome, and Tourette's disorder. In anosognosia, a person may suffer brain damage from a stroke, for example, and if you ask them to close their eyes, they may close one and believe they can't see. But if you ask them something like, "What am I holding in my hand?" they will identify it. If you ask them how they identify it with their eyes closed, they can't answer. They're not lying, they just literally don't know. In alien hand syndrome, patients who have had their left and right brain hemispheres severed or disconnected for conditions like severe epilepsy can sometimes develop competition between their hands. One might be trying to take another bite of ice cream, while the other, more concerned with their waistline presumably, tries to stop it. And with Tourette's disorder, people unfortunately feel compelled to say the most socially inappropriate things imaginable, completely contrary to their expressed value systems. So the brain is not always this perfectly cohesive and agreeable unit. It can have competing parts, and sometimes cognitive dissonance emerges when someone has a strong emotional tie to a political party, and when presented with logic that challenges that feeling, they get genuinely stuck and possibly defensive, especially if your way of convincing them feels like an attack. So be nice, be patient, and present good evidence for your position instead of insulting the one listening. As I was trained in graduate school, you cannot present an academically honest paper if you only address it from one side. You have to genuinely and honestly present the opposing position with a logical and coherent argument, and then discuss and hopefully provide good evidence that the alternative view is better, and also in a way that allows the reader to draw their own conclusions rather than you beating them over the head with it. Bear in mind, too, that humans also have a gigantic tendency towards confirmation bias, and this is a problem even at the highest levels of scientific research. We often unconsciously seek out information that supports our position and neglect or ignore information that might refute it. It's not quite the same thing, but it is a little bit like the cocktail party effect, where we might be in deep conversation with someone, but then suddenly notice our name being said several meters away across the room by someone else. Our attention can suddenly zero in on things we feel are personally relevant, for a moment filtering out everything else to the contrary. And yet, in this example, you weren't even listening for your name, yet your brain was able to latch on to that immediately, without conscious awareness. Similarly, we tend to filter out information that threatens our implicit beliefs about a political candidate, and it can be really hard to identify these biases, especially when it feels like there's a personal vested interest in them. Also super important is to own your feelings and behavior. Don't blame your feelings and behaviors on others. That's just irresponsible. I have a video on my channel titled Conflict Resolution where I discuss this in more detail, and I often work with this issue as a psychologist and therapist, especially in couples and family therapy. I get where it comes from, As kids, we usually learn the blame game from our parents or caregivers who may have been modeling unhealthy communication styles. And then we're also basically saturated with that type of communication in the mainstream media and general culture at work and at school. This type of cause and effect thinking is just not healthy. It's not entirely accurate to say someone makes you angry. That implies that you're just a puppet and the other person controls the strings and makes you feel your emotions. It is also possible, for example, that you could have more patience or curiosity about what the other person is saying, or more understanding of where they might be coming from. You may or may not like the Bible, but a good example of this is when Peter asks Jesus, "How often should I forgive my brother if he sins against me? Up to 7 times?" And Jesus responds and says, no, try 70 times 7. So for those of us who are not great at math, and without breaking out the calculator, that of course is almost 500 times. And I'm sure most of us are ready to snap at the 10th transgression. Basically what this is saying is our definition of patience with others, and sometimes ourselves too, is arbitrary and subjective. It's whatever we feel like it should be. So maybe we also need to take a look at our impatience as having nothing to do with the other person and much more to do with what is going on inside of us. That is true emotional accountability. Bear that in mind when you reach for the taser. Secondly, even if your anger is justified, does that mean that you are justified in an aggressive response? Isn't this what we are trying to teach 3-year-olds when they fight over a toy? Having anger is not an automatic license to taking it out on someone else. Being aggressive when it isn't really necessary only communicates one thing, that you haven't yet learned how to regulate your own feelings. And the only one that can be responsible for that, if you're really honest with yourself, is you. Blaming someone for feeling triggered is just an excuse to let yourself off the hook of personal accountability. So I'm sorry if that part sounds a little rough, but that goes for me too. I think this piece of advice alone can go a long way in reducing conflict because now you have to own your stuff, including your criticism and judging of others when you have so much to work on in your own life. We can all be a little hypocritical sometimes, even if it's well-intentioned. And final point, in the spirit or the real spirit of Thanksgiving, it is unfortunate, in my view, that Black Friday has increasingly been overshadowed, or Black Friday has increasingly overshadowed Thanksgiving. And it used to be its own day. Then it started to kick off on Thursday afternoons, and now it basically precedes Thanksgiving by several weeks. I'm all for some good deals, but there is a problem with this relentless consumerism that is contributing to the mental health decay in America today. We are constantly marketed to and told to acquire shiny new things, even when we quite often already possess those things. The problem here is that it's an implicit communication of what is supposedly missing from our lives, rather than an appreciation of what we already have. This is one of the reasons why consistent gratitude practice is a natural antidepressant, and the drive for material gain can be insatiable and leave you feeling miserable. The same goes for Thanksgiving. It is an opportunity to be genuinely thankful that you have family and friends, a roof over your head without missiles raining down upon it, an abundance of food, and a country where you can have political discourse without the risk of losing your life, being thrown into prison, being beheaded, just because you expressed your political views. So maybe this year, despite the deep political divides, instead of criticizing and judging others with different views, we should all just look in the mirror and see where we can be more understanding, more patient, and grateful for the good things we already have. I suspect that could make for a far more pleasant Thanksgiving dinner experience than the Squid Games version you might have been dreading. Final word. It is of course possible that you just won't see eye to eye at any level with some family and friends. But an important point to consider here is that these irreconcilable differences are competitive in nature and imply a winner and a loser. And that is never supportive of good relationships. So as we say sometimes in therapy, do you want to be right or do you want to be in relationship? Can you still love and respect someone no matter how much you disagree with them? Ultimately, that is your decision. But that is a choice based on whether you value the relationship and the person more than the positions that they hold. So thank you for watching, and I hope your family gatherings are happy and peaceful this year.